My family erased me for 5 years, then walked into my restaurant uninvited. My father slammed a contract down on my table and demanded I sign over 25% of my business, or he would call my landlord tonight to terminate my lease. I am Hazel Montgomery, 33 years old, and my family had no idea that the landlord they were threatening me with was actually me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who underestimated your worth. The Friday night dinner rush at my restaurant in downtown Chicago was a symphony of controlled chaos. As the executive chef and owner, I thrived in the heat of the kitchen. The rhythmic chopping of knives against oak cutting boards, the violent sizzle of prime Wagyu beef hitting hot cast iron pans, and the rich scent of truffle and brown butter filling the air were the rewards of my relentless hard work. I was inspecting a perfectly plated dish when my general manager rushed through the swinging doors. His face was pale, and he looked completely panicked. He told me there was a major issue in the main dining room. A party of 3 had bypassed the host stand, commandeered my most exclusive corner booth, ordered our most expensive vintage wines, and were now loudly demanding to see the owner. I wiped my hands on my apron, adjusted my chef coat, and pushed through the doors into the softly lit dining room. The ambient chatter of my wealthy clientele usually brought me peace, but tonight, a harsh and demanding voice cut through the elegant atmosphere. I froze for a fraction of a second when I recognized the people sitting at the table. It was my father Richard, my mother Diana, and my younger sister Felicia. I had not seen them since the night they threw me out into a freezing Chicago snowstorm 5 years ago. Richard sat at the head of the table wearing his usual arrogant scowl and a custom-tailored suit that I knew he could no longer afford. Diana was dripping in pearls, sipping a glass of wine that cost more than my first month of rent when I was homeless. Felicia, the undisputed golden child of the family, sat there inspecting her nails draped in designer clothes that looked brand new. They had ordered a feast: caviar dry-aged steaks, multiple appetizers, and our most premium champagne. I walked over to the table, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression entirely blank. Richard did not even offer a greeting. Instead, he reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick legal document, and slammed it down onto the white tablecloth right next to a plate of half-eaten oysters. He looked up at me with the same condescending glare he had used to control me my entire childhood. He announced loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear that I was going to sign this contract tonight. He demanded that I transfer 25% of my restaurant shares directly to Felicia. He claimed it was the least I could do to repay the family for all the trouble I had caused them. He leaned back in his chair and smiled a cruel and confident smile. He told me that if I refused, he would make a single phone call to Gregory, the man he believed owned this commercial building. Richard boasted that he and Gregory were old golf buddies, and he promised he would have my lease terminated before the restaurant opened for brunch tomorrow. Diana set her wine glass down and chimed in right on cue. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. She told me I should be grateful they were even giving me a chance to make amends. She reminded me that my sister was going through a difficult time with her startup. She raised her voice, making sure everyone around us knew my past. She said I was nothing but a college dropout who got incredibly lucky opening a restaurant. She insisted that since they raised me, they were entitled to a portion of my success to help the child who actually had real potential. I stood there listening to their demands, observing the sheer audacity of their entitlement. They had ignored my existence for half a decade, and now they felt they could simply walk and consume thousands of dollars worth of my food and steal a quarter of my life's work. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply raised my hand and signaled for my manager to bring over the wireless payment terminal. When he handed it to me, I typed in the total amount for their extravagant meal, which came to exactly $4,000. I pulled my solid metal black credit card from my pocket, tapped it against the screen, and authorized the payment for their table myself. I looked down at Richard and calmly informed him that their meal was fully paid for, considering it a final parting gift. At a table nearby, a distinguished gentleman in a tailored navy suit watched the entire interaction. He took a sip of his bourbon, smiled slightly, and reached into his jacket to pull out his phone. Richard slammed his fist on the table, rattling the crystal glasses. He was furious that I was not trembling in fear. He had expected the scared, compliant daughter he had bullied for years, not a successful executive chef who remained entirely unfazed by his threats. He pointed a finger at my face and escalated his attack. He warned me that I was making a massive mistake. He threatened to call his contacts in the media and have the city's top food critics write scathing reviews that would destroy my reputation. He promised to ruin my business until I was begging them for a job. Felicia saw the tension rising and immediately slipped into her favorite role as the eternal victim. She forced tears into her eyes, her lip quivering dramatically. She accused me of being a bitter and selfish person. She whined that I had always been jealous of her, and that I was intentionally trying to punish her just because she was going through a rough patch. She cried loudly, asking why I could not just be a supportive sister for once in my life. I placed my hands flat on the edge of their table and leaned in close. My voice was low, sharp, and absolutely void of any emotion. I asked Felicia if her definition of selfishness was anything like the time I discovered she had stolen my college tuition money to fund her shopping addiction for luxury handbags. I asked her if it was selfish when she framed me for the missing money, playing the innocent victim, while watching our parents drag me to the front door. I reminded them of the exact temperature that night, how it was freezing outside when they locked me out of the house with nothing but a backpack simply because I dared to accuse their perfect golden child of being a thief. Diana gasped and clutched her chest, acting deeply offended by my words. She immediately deployed her classic psychological manipulation. She claimed they were simply practicing tough love. She insisted they were teaching me a lesson about family loyalty and respect. She callously added that I had ended up dropping out of college anyway, so the tuition money would have been wasted on me regardless. She justified their abuse by framing it as a necessary step for my personal growth. Right at that exact moment, Richard's cell phone began to vibrate violently on the table. The screen lit up, displaying the name Gregory in bold letters. The blood instantly drained from Richard's face. He stared at the ringing phone as if it were a venomous snake. I stood up straight, crossed my arms, and offered him a polite, chilling smile. I told him he really ought to answer that call. I mentioned that Gregory was likely calling to deliver some extremely interesting news regarding their golf club conversations. Richard ignored the ringing phone, his hands shaking slightly as he shoved it into his pocket. He scrambled to regain his authoritative posture, trying desperately to maintain the upper hand in front of the surrounding diners, who were now openly staring at our table. He stood up, towering over the table, and issued his final ultimatum. He told me I had exactly 48 hours to sign the equity transfer documents. He swore that if the contract was not on his desk by Sunday morning, the city marshals would be chaining these doors shut and putting my equipment out on the street. Diana and Felicia gathered their expensive coats and designer bags, casting final glares of pure venom in my direction. Diana loudly proclaimed that I was a lost cause and a disgrace to the family name. Felicia deliberately bumped her shoulder hard against mine as she walked past, whispering that I was going to lose everything I had built. They marched out of the restaurant in a dramatic procession, leaving a trail of hostile energy in their wake. I did not move until the heavy glass doors swung shut behind them. The dining room slowly returned to its normal rhythm, the gentle clinking of silverware replacing the harsh echoes of my family's threats. I took a deep breath, letting the tension release from my shoulders. The gentleman in the navy suit who had been watching from the corner booth quietly stood up and approached me. This was Nathan, my brilliant corporate attorney and one of my most trusted allies. He held a thick manila folder in his hands, tapping it thoughtfully against his side. He looked toward the front door where my family had just exited and shook his head in absolute disbelief. Nathan handed me the heavy legal file. He noted how incredibly arrogant Richard was to threaten me with eviction. He pointed out the sheer irony of their demands, considering they had absolutely no idea that I did not lease this restaurant space. He opened the folder, revealing the verified financial records we had been tracking for months. Nathan stated that my family was completely oblivious to the fact that Felicia had secretly taken out a $2 million hard money loan, forging documents to put the debt entirely under Richard's real estate company name. He looked at me with a sharp, calculating gleam in his eye and asked exactly when I planned to tell them the truth. He wanted to know when I would reveal that I was not just the chef of this restaurant, but the sole legal owner of the entire commercial building they were standing in. Early Saturday morning, the air inside my kitchen was thick and rich with the scent of simmering veal bone broth and roasted garlic. I stood alone at the pristine stainless steel prep station, meticulously reviewing the weekend inventory sheets. This was my favorite time of day, the quiet sanctuary before my staff arrived, and the relentless heat of the dinner service began. I had built this sanctuary from absolute scratch, pouring every ounce of my sweat and passion into these walls. That peaceful silence was abruptly shattered by the violent rattling of the front glass doors. Someone was violently pulling on the locked brass handles, followed by a heavy, impatient kick against the doorframe. I wiped my hands on a clean white towel, smoothed the front of my chef coat, and walked calmly into the main dining room. Felicia stood in the entryway, furiously shaking the door. When she saw me, she rolled her eyes and gestured aggressively for me to let her in. I unlocked the deadbolt, and she shoved past me without a word of greeting. She was clutching a massive iced coffee in one hand and a thick roll of architectural blueprints in the other. Behind her hovered a nervous-looking man, carrying a laser tape measure and a heavy binder filled with fabric swatches. Felicia did not even look at me as she marched straight toward the center of my dining room, her designer heels clicking sharply and obnoxiously against the reclaimed oak floorboards. She pointed her coffee cup directly at the custom Italian marble bar that I had spent 6 months sourcing and importing. She loudly instructed the designer to tear the entire structure down. She complained that the dark marble was incredibly depressing and claimed they needed a bright open concept for her new VIP cocktail lounge. The designer hesitated, shifting his weight nervously and glancing back at me as I stood perfectly still by the entrance. Felicia finally turned her attention to me, flashing a brilliant, utterly fake smile that did not reach her eyes. She cheerfully announced that she was just getting a head start on renovating her new investment. I did not say a single word. I simply crossed my arms and watched her perform her predictable routine. Felicia always interpreted my silence as submission. She began pacing the dining room with exaggerated authority, criticizing the warm amber lighting fixtures insulting the intimate table layout, and complaining that the seating was far too cramped for high-end clientele. She spotted my lead prep cook, Hector, who had just walked out of the kitchen holding a tray of fresh herbs. Felicia snapped her manicured fingers at him in a demeaning gesture. She demanded he throw the herbs in the trash immediately, because she was changing the menu to fusion tapas, boldly claiming my current culinary vision was dated and completely boring. The sheer audacity of her entitlement was staggering. She truly believed Richard's threats from the night before had broken my spirit. She believed that 5 years of absence meant I was still the terrified scapegoat who would surrender my life's work just to avoid a family argument. I looked at Hector, offered him a reassuring nod, and calmly instructed him to return to the kitchen and completely ignore the trespasser. Felicia saw Hector walk away and her fake smile instantly vanished. She crossed her arms and glared at me, her face twisting into an ugly sneer. She accused me of being stubborn, ungrateful, and pathetic. She loudly reminded me of what our father had said at the table last night. She insisted that if I did not hand over the 25% equity by Sunday morning, I would be evicted and left with absolutely nothing. She laughed a cruel, mocking laugh, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She said I should be getting down on my knees and thanking her for stepping in to fix my tacky restaurant before it failed completely. She marched up to me, leaning in close so I could smell the sweet vanilla perfume she always wore. She lowered her voice to a venomous whisper, bringing up the exact past she knew used to hurt me. She reminded me of the time she took my college tuition money to fund her shopping addiction, claiming our parents gave it to her because she actually had a bright future while I was just a bitter failure destined to drop out. She told me this was the exact same situation. She said the family was simply reallocating resources to the child who deserved them. and that I needed to step aside and let the real talent take over. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage with her toxic rewriting of history. I did not shed a single tear. I simply reached into the pocket of my chef coat, pulled out my smartphone, and dialed 911. I kept my eyes locked directly on her horrified face as the emergency dispatcher answered the call. I clearly and calmly reported a hostile trespasser who was aggressively refusing to leave my commercial property, and I requested immediate police assistance. Felicia gasped, taking a sudden step back. She asked if I was seriously calling the cops on my own sister. She called me a psycho and screamed that I was making a massive mistake that would ruin my life. She desperately tried to maintain her illusion of control by ordering her designer to start measuring the walls anyway. The poor designer looked at her, looked at my icy expression, and quickly apologized to me. He packed up his fabric swatches, backed away toward the door, and fled the restaurant entirely without looking back. Felicia was left standing all alone in the center of the room, her face flushed a deep angry red. Within 10 minutes, 2 uniformed Chicago police officers walked through the front doors. Felicia immediately switched into her charming, vulnerable victim persona. She rushed toward them, her voice softening into a sweet, helpless tone. She told the officers there was a huge misunderstanding. She claimed she was a legal partner in this establishment, a co-owner just trying to do some morning renovations before opening, and she falsely stated that her sister was having a severe mental breakdown. The taller officer looked at me for confirmation, his hand resting casually on his radio. I did not argue with her lies. I calmly walked over to the host stand, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out my heavily embossed municipal business license, along with the certified property deed. I walked over and handed the documents directly to the officer. I stated clearly and firmly that I was the sole legal owner of both the business operations and the physical building itself. I pointed directly at Felicia and confirmed she had absolutely no legal right to be on the premises. She owned nothing, and I wanted her removed for trespassing immediately. The officer carefully reviewed the watermarked documents, nodded in understanding, and handed them back to me. He turned to Felicia, his demeanor shifting to strict authority. He firmly instructed her to step outside the building right now. Felicia completely lost her mind. The sweet facade she had just put on shattered instantly. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, shouting that she was a Montgomery and threatening that her father would have their badges stripped for disrespecting her. She planted her feet wide and flatly refused to move. When the second officer reached out to gently guide her by the arm, she violently jerked away and swung her body around. That sudden aggressive movement caused her oversized designer tote bag to slip off her shoulder. It hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud, unzipping completely and spilling its contents everywhere. Expensive cosmetics designer sunglasses, a leather wallet, and a thick manila folder scattered across the ground. The folder slid open upon impact, revealing a massive stack of dense financial documents. As the 2 officers finally grabbed Felicia by both arms and physically marched her toward the exit while she kicked and screamed obscenities. I knelt down to gather the spilled items so I could throw them out the door after her. My eyes caught the bold red logo of a major commercial lender printed on the top page of the scattered documents. It was a high-interest, hard-money loan agreement for $2 million. The borrower listed at the top was Horizon Holdings, my personal corporate entity that I used to purchase this building. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as my gaze dropped to the bottom of the page. There, sitting starkly on the designated signature line, was my own name. It was a flawless, undeniable forgery of my signature used to steal millions, and the deadline for the balloon payment was stamped for this coming Friday. I stared at the signature, the blue ink seemingly burning a hole straight through the crisp white paper. It was my name, Hazel Montgomery, but the hand that had guided the pen belonged to a thief. The letters were perfectly crafted to mimic my handwriting, an intentional and malicious forgery, sitting at the bottom of a high-interest hard money loan agreement for $2 million. Nathan immediately dropped to one knee beside me. His sharp eyes scanned the dense legal text, absorbing the financial jargon with the speed of a seasoned corporate attorney. He reached out, gently took the manila folder from my hands, and stood up. His demeanor shifted instantly from a supportive friend to a ruthless legal predator. He looked at the heavy glass doors where the police had just dragged my screaming sister away, then looked back at me. He instructed me to lock the front doors, flip the closed sign, and follow him to my private office immediately. We walked through the silent dining room, the chaotic energy of the morning clash evaporating into a heavy, suffocating tension. Once inside my office, I locked the heavy oak door and pulled the blinds shut. Nathan spread the crumpled documents across my wide mahogany desk, smoothing out the wrinkled edges. I leaned over his shoulder, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, as we began to dissect the paper trail Felicia had so carelessly dropped. The documents were not just a simple loan agreement, they were a comprehensive financial trap. Nathan opened his secure laptop, logged into a private legal database, and asked for my social security number. I recited the 9 digits, a sinking feeling settling deep in my stomach. For the past 5 years, I had operated my entire culinary empire under the protective shield of my corporate entity, Horizon Holdings. I had never needed to check my personal consumer credit history because my business revenue spoke for itself. That singular oversight had provided my family with the perfect shadow to operate within. Nathan's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up deeply buried financial records and comprehensive background checks. The screen populated with a dizzying array of red flags, delinquent notices, and massive lines of credit that I had never authorized. He pointed to a specific date on the screen, his voice tight with controlled anger. He highlighted the original origination date of the very first fraudulent loan. It was dated November 12th, exactly 5 years ago. The air in my office suddenly felt freezing cold. November 12th. The date echoed in my mind, triggering a tidal wave of suppressed memories. That was the exact week my entire life had been detonated. That was the week I had confronted Felicia about stealing my college tuition funds to finance her reckless luxury shopping sprees. That was the exact night my parents had turned on me, dragging me by my arms to the front door, screaming that I was a jealous, delusional liar who was trying to ruin my sister's reputation. They had thrown me out into a blinding Chicago snowstorm with nothing but the clothes on my back, completely severing all ties and erasing me from the family. I gripped the edge of the desk, my knuckles turning white as the horrifying truth finally clicked into place. The fight over the tuition money had been nothing but a calculated, deliberate smokescreen. It was a theatrical distraction designed to hide a much darker reality. Felicia had not just stolen my cash. She had stolen my entire identity. She had used my clean, unblemished credit score and my social security number to secure the initial seed money for her first doomed startup venture. When the bank paperwork was finalizing, they needed a foolproof way to ensure I would never discover the fraud. They needed me gone, erased, and completely discredited. If I was officially labeled as a bitter, jealous thief who had been disowned by her own family, no one would ever believe me if I somehow stumbled upon the loan documents. My parents had orchestrated my exile not out of misguided tough love, but to protect their precious golden child from facing federal prison for identity theft and wire fraud. They had literally sacrificed my future to finance her delusions. Nathan brought my attention back to the physical documents on the desk. He explained the mechanics of the specific hard money loan Felicia had dropped. These types of lenders did not play by traditional banking rules. They operated in the gray areas of corporate finance, providing massive sums of cash at exorbitant interest rates, but they required absolute ironclad collateral. Richard had used his own real estate development company as the phantom guarantor for Felicia's fraudulent application, but the primary borrower listed on the official deed of trust was Hazel Montgomery. That clever legal maneuvering had protected Richard from direct liability in the early stages, effectively wrapping a financial noose tightly around my neck, while they spent millions in my name. They had bled the borrowed accounts dry, funneling the cash to keep Richard's failing business afloat, and to maintain Diana and Felicia's lavish lifestyle. Nathan tapped his pen against the bottom paragraph of the contract, circling a specific clause written in bold red ink. He highlighted the repayment terms, reading them aloud, so the reality would fully sink in. This was a balloon loan. That meant the principal balance of $2 million plus hundreds of thousands in accumulated penalty interest was not paid in monthly installments. The entire staggering amount was due in one single massive payment. I looked at the specific date stamped next to the maturity clause. The deadline for the balloon payment was this coming Friday. Today was Tuesday. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Last night's uninvited dinner appearance had absolutely nothing to do with family reconciliation or celebrating my culinary success. It was a desperate, panicked shakedown. My family was completely out of time and out of options. Richard's real estate company was tied to this fraudulent debt. If the loan defaulted on Friday, the hard money lenders would immediately seize his remaining assets, expose the forged documents, and trigger a catastrophic chain reaction that would end in severe criminal charges for both him and Felicia. That was the exact reason Richard had stormed into my dining room demanding a 25% equity stake in my restaurant. He did not want to run a kitchen. He needed my verified, highly profitable cash flow and the immaculate valuation of my business to secure a last-minute bridge loan. A 25% share of a Michelin-caliber restaurant in downtown Chicago was the exact amount of collateral he needed to appease his creditors and refinance the debt before Friday. He was trying to use my own success to pay off the money they had stolen in my name. A dark, dangerous calm washed over me. The betrayal was so profound, so utterly vile, that it completely bypassed sorrow and turned into pure cold calculation. They had thrown me to the wolves expecting me to die in the cold. Instead, I had built an empire, and now they were trying to steal the very walls of that empire to save themselves from a slaughter they had orchestrated. Nathan closed his laptop and looked at me, his expression deadly serious. He warned me that cornered animals are the most dangerous. He stated that Richard and Felicia now knew the police had been involved this morning, which meant their timeline was shrinking rapidly. If they could not force me to sign those equity transfer papers by tomorrow, they would resort to extreme measures to sabotage the restaurant and force my hand. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk and safely deposited the forged loan documents alongside my authentic property deed. I told Nathan to let them try. I instructed him to prepare the financial guillotine to gather every piece of evidence regarding the identity theft, the wire fraud, and Richard's complicity in the cover-up. I wanted the trap set and ready to spring the second they made their final move. My phone vibrated on the desk, interrupting our strategy session. It was a text message from Hector in the kitchen. He urgently requested that I come to the walk-in freezer immediately. He stated that one of the new sous chefs, a man Richard had mysteriously recommended just 2 weeks ago, was acting extremely suspicious around our imported Wagyu deliveries. I locked my phone, my eyes narrowing as I looked at Nathan. The desperate sabotage had already begun, but they had severely underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. I folded the forged loan document, tucked it securely into my inner chef coat pocket, and met Nathan's eyes. We did not need to exchange a single word. He knew exactly what that piece of paper represented, and he knew I was no longer playing defense. I left him in my office to continue compiling the fraud evidence and marched straight toward the main kitchen. The Friday morning prep was in full swing, a beautiful, violent symphony of clattering pans, shouting line cooks, and the intense heat of industrial burners. This was my sanctuary. Every single tile on the floor, every piece of stainless steel equipment, and every recipe on the menu was a testament to my survival. I was not about to let anyone destroy it. My focus was entirely on the heavy insulated door of the main walk-in freezer at the very back of the restaurant. Hector, my most trusted prep cook, stood casually beside the door, pretending to inventory a massive crate of root vegetables. His eyes, however, were locked anxiously on the thick glass window of the freezer. As I approached, he leaned in close and whispered that the new sous chef Marcus had been inside for far too long. Richard had mysteriously recommended Marcus to my hiring manager just 2 weeks ago, claiming he was doing a favor for an old friend by securing me top-tier culinary talent. I had been suspicious from the moment Marcus stepped into my kitchen, but I hired him to keep my enemies exactly where I could see them. Hector informed me that Marcus had sent the other prep cooks away and was currently messing with the temperature control panels in the back corner of the freezer. I did not burst through the door. I did not yell. I calmly pulled out my smartphone and opened the restaurant's private security application. When I built this establishment, I did not just install cameras in the dining room to monitor the guests. I installed hidden high-definition lenses in every critical area of the kitchen, including the dry aging room and the main walk-in freezer. I tapped the screen and watched the live feed load. The image was crystal clear. Marcus was not organizing the fresh shipments of Japanese Wagyu beef. He was not checking the inventory of our imported Alba truffles or the beluga caviar. He had the protective metal casing of the digital thermostat completely unscrewed and resting on a shelf. He was holding a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters, systematically searching for the primary coolant lines. I watched him through the screen as he prepared to sever the exact wires that would trigger a complete thermal failure. He was attempting to quietly spoil nearly $50,000 worth of premium irreplaceable inventory right before the busiest weekend of the year. He was trying to cripple my cash flow and force me into bankruptcy exactly as Richard had ordered. I pocketed my phone, grabbed the heavy metal latch, and yanked the freezer door open. The blast of sub-zero air hit my face instantly, carrying the rich, earthy scent of aging beef and fresh herbs. Marcus jumped violently, dropping the wire cutters. The heavy metal tool clattered loudly against the steel grating of the floor. He spun around, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated panic. He immediately started stammering rapidly, throwing together a pathetic lie. He claimed the temperature gauge was malfunctioning, stating that it was running too warm, and he was simply trying to fix the wiring before the expensive meat spoiled. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger or surprise. I slowly walked into the freezing room, allowing the heavy, insulated door to swing shut and seal us inside the icy, quiet vault. The ambient noise of the busy kitchen was instantly muted, leaving only the low hum of the refrigeration unit. I bent down, picked up the wire cutters from the floor, examined the sharp blades, and then looked him dead in the eye. I pulled my phone back out, held the screen up to his face, and played the high-definition video of him deliberately sabotaging the cooling unit. The color completely drained from his face. The sweat that had formed on his forehead instantly turned cold. I told him he had exactly 2 options, and he needed to choose one before I counted to 3. I explained that option 1 involved me walking out of this freezer, handing this video footage directly to the Chicago Police Department, and pressing felony charges for corporate sabotage and the attempted destruction of $50,000 of private property. I assured him with absolute certainty that I had the legal power to ensure he faced years in federal prison and would never be allowed to work in a professional kitchen ever again. I took a slow step forward, invading his personal space. I told him that option 2 involved him being a remarkably smart and obedient employee for the next 5 minutes. I watched him swallow hard, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe in the freezing air. He was visibly shaking, terrified of the calm, calculating monster he had just awakened. He quietly asked what I wanted him to do, his voice cracking with fear. I ordered him to take his cell phone out of his apron pocket. I instructed him to dial Richard Montgomery immediately. I told him to put the phone on speaker and hold it out between us so I could hear every single word. I warned him that if he deviated from my exact script by a single syllable, or if he tried to tip Richard off, option 1 would go back on the table immediately. Marcus nodded frantically, his freezing fingers fumbling as he unlocked his screen and dialed the number. Richard answered on the second ring. His voice dripped with impatient, arrogant anticipation. He did not even say hello. He simply asked Marcus if the job was done. Marcus looked at me, terror in his eyes. I gave him a sharp, confirming nod. Marcus cleared his throat, trying to force his voice to sound steady. He told Richard that the mission was accomplished. He lied flawlessly, stating that the main coolant line was severed, the backup generator was disabled, and all of Hazel's premium inventory would be rotting garbage by tomorrow morning. He added the exact detail I had instructed him to say, assuring Richard that the restaurant would be forced to close its doors for the entire weekend, completely destroying my revenue stream. Richard let out a loud, triumphant laugh that echoed through the small freezer. The sheer malice in his voice was palpable. He praised Marcus, calling him a brilliant investment. Richard promised that the second half of his bribe money would be wired to his offshore account within the hour. Richard then began to gloat, his true colors bleeding through the speaker. He bragged that I would be utterly ruined by Sunday. He painted a picture of me begging him for a financial bailout, forced to sign over the 25% equity stake just to keep the lights on and pay my staff. He told Marcus to pack his knives, leave the city immediately, and enjoy the money. Then Richard abruptly hung up the phone. I took the cell phone from Marcus's shaking hand and casually dropped it into a deep bucket of crushed ice sitting next to the seafood station. I pointed toward the heavy metal door. I told him to get out of my restaurant and never show his face in Chicago again. Marcus did not hesitate. He sprinted out of the freezer, leaving his expensive chef knives and his entire career behind. I stood alone in the freezing cold, surrounded by the perfectly preserved inventory that was supposed to be my absolute ruin. Richard believed he had completely cornered me. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of psychological chess, destroying my resources to force my submission before his own fraudulent loan came due on Friday. It was time to show him that I was not playing chess. I was burning the entire board to the ground. I walked out of the freezer, bypassed the busy prep stations, and headed straight back to my private office. I sat down at my mahogany desk, opened my secure laptop, and accessed a highly encrypted file Nathan had provided me weeks ago when we first began investigating Felicia's massive financial trail. I scrolled past the bank statements and pulled up a crystal-clear security photograph taken inside a high-stakes VIP casino room in Las Vegas just 3 days ago. The image showed Felicia, the supposedly innocent golden child, who was allegedly crying over a failing tech startup. She was sitting at a private roulette table, frantically pushing massive stacks of $100 chips onto the felt. Her eyes were manic, her posture desperate. She was not running a business. She was feeding a massive, uncontrollable gambling addiction, using the millions she had stolen by forging my name. I pulled out a secure burner phone I kept in my desk drawer. I created an untraceable anonymous message thread and attached the high-resolution casino photograph. I typed a simple, devastating message directed exclusively at my mother. I asked Diana if she wanted to know exactly where the money from their third mortgage and Felicia's imaginary startup was actually going. I hit send, delivering the weapon directly to Diana's phone. I locked the screen, sat back in my chair, and prepared to watch their perfect, unified family facade tear itself apart from the inside out. The fallout from my text message did not take long to arrive. Less than an hour after I hit send on that casino photograph, the heavy brass knocker on my apartment door began to rattle with frantic urgency. I lived in a secure penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, a quiet fortress I had purchased specifically because it was entirely inaccessible to people like my family. But Diana had always been resourceful when she was desperate. She had likely sweet-talked or bullied the downstairs concierge into letting her up to my private floor. I walked across the dark hardwood floor, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. My mother pushed her way inside before I could even offer a greeting. She looked completely unhinged. Her usually immaculate hair was disheveled, and her expensive mascara was carefully smudged under her eyes to give the illusion of immense suffering. She collapsed onto my white leather sofa, burying her face in her hands, and began to sob loudly. The performance was worthy of an Academy Award. For a few minutes, I simply stood by the kitchen island, sipping a glass of sparkling water, and watched her cry. I did not rush over to comfort her. I did not offer her a tissue. 5 years ago, those tears would have shattered my heart. When I was a child, my mother crying was the ultimate weapon. It was the signal that I had failed, that I was a bad daughter, and I would have done absolutely anything to stop her tears and earn back her approval. Now I saw them for exactly what they were: ammunition. When she realized I was not going to take the bait and rushed to her side, her sobs slowly dialed down to dramatic sniffles. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading. She started her monologue with the classic guilt trip, wrapping her toxic demands in the sacred veil of motherhood. She told me she was terrified. She claimed that seeing that picture of Felicia in Las Vegas broke her heart, but it also made her realize how sick my sister truly was. Diana insisted that Felicia was not a criminal. She was just a confused, overwhelmed girl who made a tiny mistake because the pressure of her startup was simply too much for her fragile mental health. A tiny mistake. $2 million of wire fraud, identity theft, and blatant forgery was a tiny mistake in my mother's eyes. Diana stood up and closed the distance between us. She reached out and grabbed my hands, her grip surprisingly tight. She looked at me with what she thought was a loving, maternal expression. She begged me to find it in my heart to forgive my sister. She told me that family always forgives each other no matter what happens. She pleaded with me to just sign the equity transfer papers for the restaurant, promising that the money would go directly to paying off the hard money loan. She swore that if I just gave them this 125% stake, they would pay for Felicia to go to a luxury rehabilitation center for gambling addiction, and the police would never have to be involved. She looked into my eyes and said I was the only one who could save my sister from going to federal prison. She asked me to do it for my mother who had given me life and sacrificed everything to raise me. She reminded me of all the meals she cooked, the clothes she bought, and the roof she kept over my head, weaponizing basic parental obligations to extort my life savings. I looked down at her hands gripping mine. Her manicured nails were digging into my skin. I calmly pulled my hands away, taking a deliberate step back. I looked her dead in the eye and told her the answer was absolutely not. I explained that Felicia did not make a tiny mistake. She meticulously planned to steal my identity, drain millions of dollars under my name, and leave me holding the bag while she gambled away the profits in VIP casino rooms. I told Diana that I would not surrender a single percentage of my life's work to finance a criminal defense or pay off a fraudulent debt. I informed her that the evidence was already secured by my attorney, and the police would be fully involved the second the loan defaulted on Friday. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The second the word no left my lips, the weeping, desperate mother completely vanished. Her tears stopped instantly, her shoulders squared, her neck stiffened, and her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She stepped toward me, jabbing her index finger hard into my chest. She completely abandoned the loving mother act and unleashed a torrent of venom that filled my quiet apartment. She called me a cold-blooded, heartless monster. She screamed that I had always been a defective child devoid of any basic human empathy or loyalty. She cursed the day I was born, stating that I had brought nothing but misery and stubborn defiance into their perfect household. Diana paced the floor, throwing her arms wildly in the air, shouting that I was a bitter, jealous failure who was deliberately trying to destroy her beautiful sister out of pure spite. She screamed that I was choosing my stupid little restaurant over the freedom and life of my own flesh and blood. She yelled that I was dead to her, that I was a disgrace to the Montgomery name, and that I would end up dying completely alone, because nobody could ever love someone as vicious and unforgiving as me. She insulted my career, claiming my success was a fluke, and that I would inevitably lose everything, because I lacked the fundamental grace and class of a real Montgomery. I stood perfectly still, letting her rage wash over me like water off a stone. Her insults no longer held any power over my emotions. They were just the desperate flailings of a woman who had entirely lost control of her favorite scapegoat. When she finally paused to take a breath, her chest heaving with exertion, the room fell dead silent. I did not defend myself. I did not argue about who was right or wrong. I simply walked over to the front door, unlocked it, and pulled it wide open. I looked at Diana, my voice dropping to a low conversational tone that carried absolute, unshakable authority. I told her she was wasting her energy screaming at me in my own home. I advised her that she needed to go home right now and start packing her bags. Diana froze in the middle of the living room. Her hateful glare wavered, replaced by a sudden sharp confusion. She demanded to know what I was talking about. She angrily asked why on earth she would need to pack her bags when she lived in a multi-million-dollar estate that was completely secure. I leaned against the open door frame and gave her a look of genuine, chilling pity. I asked her if Richard had really kept her that much in the dark regarding their finances. I asked if my father had conveniently forgotten to mention that the hard money lenders required massive collateral to secure Felicia's fraudulent $2 million loan. I watched her perfectly painted face drain of all color as I delivered the final crushing blow. I told her that Richard had leveraged their primary residence to guarantee the debt because he was entirely out of cash. I asked her if she truly did not know that the family mansion had been remortgaged for the third time, and that when the loan defaulted this Friday, the bank would be foreclosing on her house. Diana stood absolutely paralyzed, her mouth slightly open, the horrifying reality of her imminent ruin finally taking hold as she stared at the open door. Diana stood frozen in my doorway, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently as the reality of her impending homelessness finally broke through her delusions. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing, as she attempted to formulate some kind of defense or demand, but only a strangled, pathetic gasp escaped her throat. The heavy gold-plated armor of her entitlement had completely shattered. I did not wait for her to recover her breath. I did not offer her a glass of water or a shoulder to cry on. I simply reached forward, grasped the heavy brass handle of my front door, and shut it firmly in her face. The deadbolt clicked into place with a satisfying metallic finality, permanently locking out the toxic manipulation I had endured for my entire life. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering, vast expanse of the Chicago skyline. The psychological battle with my mother was over, but the corporate war with Richard was rapidly approaching its climax. 3 days later, Friday night arrived with the relentless, thundering intensity of a runaway freight train. This was the exact deadline of Felicia's massive hard money loan, the day the balloon payment was due, and the energy inside my restaurant reflected the incredibly high stakes. The main dining room was completely booked to capacity, a sea of elegant patrons murmuring over plates of dry, aged duck-seared scallops and imported truffles. Inside the kitchen, the heat was intense, but the orchestration was absolutely flawless. Hector had stepped up brilliantly after I exiled Marcus to the streets. Every single culinary station operated with military precision, the line cooks moving in a synchronized dance of fire and steel. I stood at the central pass, meticulously wiping the rim of a warm porcelain plate before handing it to a waiting server. The rhythm of the dinner service was my heartbeat, steady, reliable, and perfectly under my control. That perfect rhythm was violently shattered at exactly 7:30 in the evening. The heavy stainless steel swinging doors of the kitchen burst open, and 3 individuals marched in wearing stern, uncompromising expressions and carrying thick municipal clipboards. They were not VIP customers seeking a kitchen tour. They wore official badges clipped to their lapels. The Chicago Department of Public Health had arrived right in the absolute middle of my peak dinner rush. The lead inspector, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a deeply lined face and a completely humorless expression, immediately flashed his credentials at my general manager. He loudly announced over the clatter of pans that his office had received an urgent, highly detailed anonymous tip regarding severe health code violations. He cited allegations of active pest infestations, the improper handling of raw meat, and critical failures in our refrigeration systems. He demanded that all food service operations halt immediately while his team conducted a full unannounced facility sweep. The entire kitchen staff froze in their tracks. The sizzling of hot oil and the shouting of orders ceased instantly. My general manager rushed toward me, his face pale with sheer panic, knowing full well that shutting down the kitchen on a Friday night would cost us tens of thousands of dollars in lost revenue and permanently damage our pristine reputation. I knew exactly what this was. This was Richard. He had realized Diana's emotional extortion at my apartment had failed miserably. He knew the Friday deadline had arrived, and his corporate assets were actively being seized by the hard money lenders. In a desperate, spiteful act of scorched earth retaliation, he had pulled strings with his corrupt municipal connections to destroy the restaurant he could not steal. If he was going down in flames, he wanted to drag my life's work down into the ashes with him. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or argue with the aggressive officials. I wiped my hands on a clean white towel, offered the lead inspector a polite, unwavering smile, and welcomed him to my kitchen. I instructed Hector and the rest of the line cooks to step back from their stations, secure their current dishes, and allow the health inspectors completely unrestricted access to every single corner of the facility. The inspectors aggressively fanned out their heavy flashlights, illuminating the darkest corners under the stainless steel prep tables. They checked the digital temperature logs on the walk-in freezers, the exact same freezers Marcus had attempted to sabotage just days prior. They ruthlessly swabbed the cutting boards, inspected the dry storage bins for any sign of rodent droppings, and heavily scrutinized the expiration labels on our imported seafood. I followed them calmly, my arms crossed, answering every demanding question with crisp, professional accuracy. I knew exactly what they would find. They would find absolutely nothing. I ran my kitchen with a level of sanitation that bordered on clinical obsession. Every surface was sanitized hourly. Every raw ingredient was meticulously dated, rotated, and stored at the exact optimal temperature. The inspectors spent 45 agonizing minutes tearing my operation apart, desperately searching for the catastrophic violations the anonymous tipster had explicitly promised they would find. They checked the ventilation hoods for grease buildup, tested the water temperature at the employee hand-washing stations, and scoured the chemical storage closet for improper proximity to food items. Slowly, their aggressive, confrontational demeanor began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of professional confusion. The two junior inspectors regrouped with the lead inspector near the dishwashing pit, shaking their heads in defeat. They had nothing. There were no infractions. There were no warnings. There was not even a minor citation for a misplaced sanitation towel. My kitchen was utterly bulletproof, a pristine fortress of culinary excellence that completely defied Richard's fabricated accusations. The lead inspector clicked his pen and reluctantly signed the bottom of his official municipal report, leaving the violation section completely blank. He handed the yellow carbon copy directly to me. He awkwardly apologized for the severe disruption during the dinner rush, noting defensively that he had a strict legal obligation to investigate priority complaints, no matter how unfounded they turned out to be in reality. He looked around the gleaming, spotless kitchen, a genuine smile finally breaking through his strict professional mask. He lowered his heavy clipboard and admitted that he had actually dined in my restaurant 2 months ago for his 20th wedding anniversary. He highly praised the Wagyu dish, calling it the single best meal he had ever eaten in the city of Chicago. He told me he knew the moment the complaint crossed his desk that it was likely entirely fabricated, but protocol tied his hands. He then stepped away from his junior colleagues, leaning in close to me, his voice dropping to a quiet, conspiratorial whisper. He stated that anonymous municipal tips were never truly anonymous if you knew exactly where to look in the digital filing system. He pulled a folded piece of printer paper from his inner jacket pocket and slid it across the stainless steel counter toward me. He said I might want to know exactly who filed the highly detailed complaint about rotting meat and severed coolant lines. I unfolded the paper, my eyes scanning the printed IP address and the registered contact name attached to the municipal portal submission. The name glaring back at me was not Richard Montgomery. It was not Felicia. It was someone I trusted implicitly within my own inner circle, someone who had stood right beside me while I built this empire from the ground up. The name glaring back at me on the printed municipal portal submission was David Vance, my own general manager, the very man who had stood in the kitchen 30 minutes ago feigning sheer panic and distress over the arrival of the health inspectors. He had sold me out, feeding Richard internal operational schedules and fabricating health code violations for a quick, desperate payout. I thanked the lead inspector, folded the paper tightly into a small square, and walked directly into the front dining room. David was nervously pacing near the mahogany host stand, wiping sweat from his forehead. I did not yell. I did not cause a public scene. I simply walked up to him, demanded his master security keys, and informed him that his final severance check would be mailed to his home address. He opened his mouth to argue, but he saw the absolute ice in my eyes and the way I held the printed municipal report. He swallowed his words, grabbed his winter coat, and practically sprinted out the front glass doors. I locked the deadbolt behind him, The internal rot was excised, but the main infection still remained, and the Friday loan deadline was just hours away. The very next morning, the front doors of my restaurant rattled open. I was standing at the polished marble bar meticulously reviewing the updated reservation list for the evening service. Richard strode into the empty dining room, radiating an almost suffocating aura of unearned arrogance and toxic entitlement. He was flanked by a tall, heavily cologned man wearing a bespoke charcoal suit and a predatory smirk. Richard did not offer a greeting. He marched straight up to the bar, slapped his hand flat on the cool marble, and proudly introduced his companion as Gregory Vance. The familial connection to my disgraced general manager was instantly obvious, but Richard was completely unaware that I had already fired David. Richard smugly explained that Gregory was a senior executive from Sterling Commercial Trust. He proudly announced that Sterling Trust was the elite property management firm that oversaw the master lease for Horizon Holdings. Richard had clearly spent the last 48 hours doing frantic, desperate research to find a loophole to steal my restaurant. He discovered that my business leased its physical space from a corporate entity named Horizon Holdings. In his profound, arrogant ignorance, Richard assumed Horizon Holdings was just a massive generic real estate conglomerate, and that I was merely a helpless, uneducated tenant renting the brick-and-mortar space. He had absolutely no idea that Horizon Holdings was my own private corporation and that I was the sole uncontested shareholder. He had brought a corrupt property manager to evict the actual landlord. Gregory pulled a thick, menacing stack of legal documents from his vintage leather briefcase. He adopted a tone of deep, patronizing authority, the exact kind of voice men like him reserve for women they believe are weak and easily intimidated. He demanded that we move to my private office immediately to discuss the emergency termination of my commercial lease. I offered a polite, unwavering smile. I gestured for them to follow me, leading them through the quiet morning prep activities in the kitchen and into my office. I instructed them to take a seat in the leather guest chairs opposite my wide mahogany desk. I did not sit down immediately. Instead, I walked over to the sleek Italian espresso machine resting on the side table. I calmly asked if they preferred a dark roast or a lighter, more floral blend. Richard scoffed loudly, crossing his arms over his chest. He snapped that they were not there for a social visit and demanded I sit down and face reality. Gregory, however, leaned back in his chair, crossed his legs, and arrogantly requested a double espresso. He was clearly enjoying the power trip, treating me like a subservient waitress in my own establishment. I methodically ground the fresh espresso beans, the rich, bitter aroma filling the small office. I tamped the dark grounds, locked the heavy metal portafilter into place, and watched the steaming liquid extract perfectly into 2 ceramic demitasse cups. I walked over, placed one cup in front of Gregory and the other in front of Richard. Then I finally walked around my desk, took my seat, folded my hands together, and told them the floor was entirely theirs. Gregory took a slow, deliberate sip of the espresso. He set the cup down and began a highly rehearsed, aggressive monologue. He claimed his firm had conducted a sudden emergency audit of my lease agreement overnight. He falsely stated that my restaurant was in severe violation of several commercial zoning ordinances, noise compliance codes, and structural modification rules. He forcefully slid the thick stack of documents across my desk, tapping the top page with his index finger. He announced that these were formal, legally binding eviction papers. He threatened that unless I completely vacated the premises by tomorrow morning, he would send a team of private contractors to change the locks, seize all of my expensive culinary equipment, and permanently liquidate my business assets to cover the fabricated breach of contract penalties. He warned me that a forced commercial eviction would permanently destroy my culinary career and guarantee I would never secure a business loan in Chicago ever again. Richard leaned forward, picking up right where Gregory left off. His eyes gleamed with toxic, vindictive satisfaction. He told me that my relentless stubbornness had finally ruined me. He brought up the health inspectors from the night before, completely unaware that his desperate sabotage attempt had already failed miserably. He claimed the city was closing in on me, my staff was abandoning me, and now my landlord was kicking me to the curb. He said I was entirely out of options and completely isolated, Then Richard offered his twisted, manipulative lifeline. He promised that he could make all of these problems disappear instantly. He claimed Gregory was a close personal friend who was willing to completely overlook the lease violations provided I signed a new operational partnership agreement. Richard slapped his own manila folder onto the desk aggressively, demanding the 25% equity stake in my restaurant. He told me to stop acting like a spoiled, delusional child, sign the transfer papers immediately, and let the men handle the business before I lost everything I had ever worked for. I sat in absolute, unbroken silence. I let their threats hang in the air, allowing them to bask in their fabricated, pathetic victory. I watched them sip my coffee, utterly convinced they held all the power in the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of panic or distress. I slowly reached into the pocket of my chef coat, pulled out my smartphone, and placed it flat on the center of the desk. I unlocked the screen, dialed a specific direct extension, and activated the speakerphone. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered the call. It was Nathan, acting in his capacity as the liaison for my primary financial institution. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Gregory's smug face as I spoke into the phone. I clearly and calmly instructed the bank to immediately execute a total asset freeze on all corporate and personal accounts associated with Gregory Vance and his subsidiary firm Sterling Commercial Trust. I stated for the official record that Gregory had just committed a direct, undeniable violation of his strict non-disclosure agreement by falsely claiming to represent the property management interests of Horizon Holdings without my explicit written authorization. I confirmed that as the sole legal owner and primary shareholder of the corporation, I was immediately terminating his firm's vendor contract for gross misconduct and corporate fraud. The smug, arrogant smirk instantly vanished from Gregory's face. The color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly, terrified gray. He stopped mid-sip, his hand trembling so violently that the hot espresso spilled over the rim of the ceramic cup and stained the leg of his expensive charcoal suit. He stared at me in absolute paralyzing horror as the devastating reality of his career-ending mistake finally crashed down upon him. Gregory opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rattling gasp emerged from his throat. The delicate ceramic cup slipped entirely from his trembling fingers. It shattered against the sharp edge of my mahogany desk, sending dark, scalding espresso splashing across the polished hardwood floor and completely ruining his expensive leather shoes. He did not even flinch at the hot liquid hitting his ankles. He simply stared at the speakerphone on my desk, his breathing shallow and erratic, his mind desperately trying to comprehend the catastrophic destruction of his professional career. Richard, however, was completely oblivious to the massive shift in the room's power dynamic. He scoffed loudly, slapping his hand against his knee in a gesture of exaggerated, arrogant annoyance. He looked at Gregory and sharply commanded him to ignore my pathetic, desperate theatrical display. Richard proudly announced to the room that I was simply a glorified line cook trying to play corporate hardball. He loudly insisted that my little phone call was nothing but a cheap, fabricated bluff designed to stall the inevitable eviction process. Gregory did not turn to look at my father. He kept his wide, terrified eyes locked firmly on me. His voice shook uncontrollably when he finally managed to push a complete sentence past his dry lips. He asked me, his tone laced with mounting dread, if I was the primary stakeholder of Horizon Holdings. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, slowly steepling my fingers together. I calmly confirmed his absolute worst fear. I explained that I had built my restaurant empire entirely under a strict corporate umbrella, deliberately separating my daily operational assets from my extensive real estate holdings. I told him that Horizon Holdings owned the very building we were currently sitting in, along with 6 other prime commercial properties located in the highly coveted downtown dining district. I advised Gregory that his firm, Sterling Commercial Trust, was merely a contracted vendor hired to handle mundane property management tasks, like fixing leaky pipes, collecting basic rent checks, and sweeping the parking lots. By maliciously attempting to evict the actual owner of the building on behalf of an outside third party, he had just committed a massive career-ending breach of contract. Richard's face immediately contorted into a mask of ugly, dismissive rage. He jabbed a thick finger in my direction. He yelled that this was functionally impossible. He screamed that I could not possibly own this level of premium commercial real estate because I was practically begging for basic startup capital just 5 years ago. I ignored my father entirely. My focus remained laser-locked on the crumbling property manager sitting across from me. I reached down to the bottom drawer of my desk and unlocked it with a heavy brass key. I pulled out a thick black leather-bound portfolio and placed it squarely in the center of the desk. I looked Gregory dead in the eye and prepared to deliver the second fatal blow. I told him that firing his firm for a breach of contract was only the beginning of his nightmare. I opened the portfolio, revealing hundreds of pages of dense financial records, complex bank transfers, and aggressively structured corporate debt acquisitions. I explained that my financial team was intimately aware of how poorly Sterling Commercial Trust had been performing over the last 3 years. I noted that his firm had recklessly over-leveraged themselves on failing commercial properties during the recent economic downturn. They were actively drowning in toxic unpayable loans, desperately shuffling client money around just to avoid a catastrophic, highly public default. I watched Gregory begin to actively hyperventilate as I laid out the exact blueprint of his financial ruin. I told him that exactly 8 months ago, a private equity group had systematically approached his most aggressive, unforgiving creditors. This anonymous group quietly bought up every single cent of his firm's underwater debt at a premium, consolidating it into one massive, highly weaponized financial portfolio. I tapped the heavy black folder resting on my desk. I informed Gregory that Horizon Holdings was that specific private equity group. I did not just own this single restaurant building. I owned his entire management company. I owned his mortgages, his commercial loans, and his entire professional future. He was completely, irreversibly bankrupt, and he had just arrogantly walked into the private office of the only person holding the detonator to his entire life. Gregory buried his face in his hands. He let out a pathetic, whimpering sound that echoed loudly in the quiet office. He realized he was nothing but a disposable, foolish puppet in a game he did not even know he was playing. He had eagerly conspired with Richard to destroy my career, only to discover that I held the absolute power to liquidate his entire existence with a single calm phone call. Richard shot out of his guest chair. The veins in his neck bulged with raw, unadulterated fury. He slammed his fists down hard on the surface of my desk, rattling the remaining espresso equipment. He vehemently refused to believe a single word of my detailed explanation. He screamed that this was an elaborate, convoluted scam. He called me a liar, a fraud, and an absolute disgrace to the Montgomery family name. He shouted that I lacked the fundamental intelligence and the capital required to orchestrate a corporate takeover of this magnitude. He paced frantically across the office, waving his arms wildly in the air. He aggressively declared that he was ending this pathetic charade right this second. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, yanked out his smartphone, and aggressively stabbed at the screen. He loudly announced that he was calling the elite, high-powered legal team representing the Montgomery family estate. He threatened to have his lawyers secure an emergency judicial injunction to tear apart my fake corporate shields, violently audit my bank accounts, and throw me in a federal prison for criminal extortion. He sneered that I had finally pushed him too far, and he would not rest until I was completely stripped of everything I owned. I sat perfectly still, observing his desperate, flailing tantrum with icy detachment. I told him to go ahead and make the call. I suggested he put his expensive elite lawyers on speakerphone so they could hear exactly what was about to happen next. Before Richard could press the call button, the heavy frosted glass door of my office swung wide open. The sudden forceful intrusion caused both Richard and Gregory to jump in shock. Nathan strode confidently into the room. My trusted attorney and financial liaison was no longer merely a calm voice on the speakerphone. He looked impeccably sharp in a dark navy suit carrying a sleek silver briefcase. However, Nathan did not arrive alone. Walking in perfect, intimidating synchronization directly behind him were three tall, broad-shouldered individuals wearing dark tactical vests heavily emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of federal financial regulatory agencies. They were accompanied by two uniformed Chicago police officers who immediately moved to secure the doorway, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. The atmosphere in the office instantly plummeted to a freezing, terrifying absolute zero. Richard froze, his smartphone hovering mere inches from his ear. His aggressive, commanding posture crumbled instantly, replaced by a sudden, paralyzing instinct of pure terror. He stared wide-eyed at the grim federal agents, his mouth hanging open in complete, utter disbelief. Nathan stepped forward, bypassing the trembling figure of my father entirely. He placed his silver briefcase on my desk and offered me a polite, professional nod. He then turned to face my father, holding a thick, legally binding document stamped with heavy red municipal and federal seals. Nathan cleared his throat. His voice was loud, authoritative, and completely devoid of any sympathy. He addressed Richard directly, stating that calling the Montgomery family lawyers was an excellent idea, as he was going to desperately need their services within the next 5 minutes. Nathan formally announced that the federal agents accompanying him had just secured a comprehensive multi-agency warrant. Richard stammered, attempting to demand a coherent explanation, but Nathan quickly cut him off. Nathan handed the heavily stamped document directly into my father's trembling hands. He looked Richard dead in the eye and delivered the final, devastating blow. Nathan announced that the authorities were not there for Gregory Vance or his failing property management firm. The federal agents had arrived to serve an official immediate criminal summons for Felicia Montgomery. Nathan coldly explained that the $2 million hard money loan she had secured using my stolen identity had triggered a massive federal investigation into systemic wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe banking irregularities. The authorities had already traced the fraudulent loan transfers directly back to Felicia's hidden personal accounts. Nathan stepped back, allowing the federal agents to advance on my paralyzed father. He calmly advised Richard that the financial police were currently dispatching a secondary tactical unit to the Montgomery family estate to formally place Felicia under immediate non-negotiable arrest. The heavy silence that followed Nathan's declaration was violently shattered by the sound of frantic shouting coming from the hallway just outside my office. The heavy frosted glass door, which had barely settled on its hinges, was violently shoved open. Felicia stumbled into the room, her usually flawless appearance completely wrecked. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled, her designer mascara was smeared down her cheeks, and she was clutching her luxury handbag like a life preserver. She had clearly received a frantic, hysterical phone call from Diana the moment the tactical unit breached the gates of the Montgomery estate. Instead of surrendering, my sister had foolishly fled the scene, driving recklessly straight to my restaurant because she assumed Richard had already successfully seized the property and could offer her a secure fortress. She froze the exact second her frantic eyes registered the terrifying scene inside my office. She saw Gregory Vance slumped in his chair, utterly defeated and ruined. She saw Richard standing paralyzed, completely stripped of his arrogant bravado. And then her gaze locked onto the tall, imposing federal agents wearing dark tactical vests. The lead agent did not hesitate. He immediately stepped forward, his hand resting firmly on his utility belt, and asked her to confirm her identity. Felicia stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the hardwood floor. She shook her head wildly, her eyes darting toward the open door, but the two uniformed Chicago police officers instantly moved to block her only avenue of escape. The agent did not wait for her verbal confirmation. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt and calmly informed Felicia Montgomery that she was under arrest for multiple counts of aggravated identity theft, severe wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit federal banking violations. The transformation of the Montgomery family golden child was instantaneous, absolute, and completely pathetic. The very second the cold steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around her delicate wrists, the illusion of the sophisticated, untouchable startup founder vanished into thin air. She did not maintain a shred of dignity. She did not demand to speak to her attorney with quiet, composed authority. Instead, she regressed instantly into a spoiled, terrified child throwing a massive temper tantrum. Felicia began to physically thrash against the federal agents, screaming at the top of her lungs. She demanded that they release her, shrieking that she was a Montgomery and they had absolutely no right to touch her. When the agents easily subdued her flailing arms and held her firmly in place, her sheer panic violently redirected itself toward the only person she had ever relied upon to clean up her messes. She turned her tear-streaked face toward Richard and unleashed a torrent of vicious, unadulterated venom. She screamed that this was entirely his fault. She wailed that he was supposed to fix this, that he had explicitly promised he would force me to sign over the restaurant equity to cover the fraudulent loan. She completely threw our father under the bus, shouting to the entire room and the listening federal agents that Richard knew everything about the forged documents. She hysterically confessed that Richard had actively encouraged her to use my stolen identity because his own credit was completely ruined and the family was secretly bankrupt. She sobbed that he was a useless, pathetic old man who could not even handle a simple commercial eviction to save his own daughter. Richard's face contorted into a mask of absolute horror as he realized his golden child was actively, loudly confessing to multiple federal conspiracies right in front of the authorities. He desperately lunged forward, raising his hands and frantically ordering her to shut her mouth. He yelled that she was making things infinitely worse, pleading with her to invoke her right to remain silent. Felicia ignored his warnings entirely. Cornered and terrified of federal prison, she viciously turned on Diana next, even though our mother was not in the room. She screamed that Diana was the one who originally suggested using my social security number, claiming that I owed the family for raising me and that I would never have the courage to fight back. She yelled that they had all promised her that handling that problematic, stubborn sister of hers would be incredibly easy. The perfect, loving Montgomery family was instantly cannibalizing itself, viciously tearing each other to pieces the very second their toxic foundation collapsed. I stood behind my mahogany desk, my arms comfortably crossed over my chef coat, and watched the incredible spectacle unfold. I did not smile. I did not offer any sarcastic commentary. I simply let the absolute silence of my composure highlight the chaotic, deafening roar of their self-destruction. For 34 years, I had been the designated family scapegoat. I had been told repeatedly that I was too difficult, too abrasive, and entirely lacking in the refined grace and loyalty that supposedly defined the Montgomery name. I had been constantly measured against Felicia's manufactured perfection and found severely lacking. Now I watched that exact same perfection dissolve into a puddle of smeared makeup, screaming accusations and criminal indictments. The lead federal agent had heard enough. He forcefully spun Felicia around and began reading her Miranda rights in a loud, monotonous voice that easily cut through her hysterical sobbing. He nodded to the uniformed officers who stepped forward and grabbed her by the arms. They did not care about her expensive clothes or her prominent last name. They forcefully marched her out of my office, dragging her kicking and screaming down the hallway. She wailed for her daddy to save her, her voice echoing shrilly through the back corridors of the restaurant, until the heavy metal exit doors finally slammed shut, cutting off her pathetic cries. Gregory Vance took this opportunity to attempt a quiet, cowardly exit. He slowly pushed himself up from the guest chair, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, hoping the chaos had distracted everyone from his presence. Nathan stepped gracefully into his path, blocking the doorway. Nathan calmly informed Gregory that the financial authorities would be arriving at the Sterling Commercial Trust corporate offices first thing Monday morning, and strongly advised him not to shred any documents over the weekend. Gregory swallowed hard, nodded weakly, and scurried out of the room like a beaten dog, his ruined leather shoes squeaking softly on the floor. The office suddenly fell dead silent, leaving only 3 people remaining: myself, Nathan, and Richard. My father stood in the center of the room looking completely hollowed out. The arrogant, commanding patriarch, who had aggressively marched into my establishment demanding my submission, was completely gone. His broad shoulders were severely slumped, his chest was heaving with erratic, shallow breaths, and his hands hung limply at his sides. The sheer, overwhelming arrogance he had carried for decades had evaporated, replaced by a sudden, crushing wave of absolute, unadulterated terror. He looked at the empty doorway where his favorite daughter had just been dragged out in federal handcuffs, and then he slowly turned his hollow eyes back to me. He knew exactly what was required to secure a federal conviction of that magnitude. He knew that the authorities had the bank records and the wire transfers, but they absolutely needed the primary victim to testify. They needed the original forensic evidence, the digital logs I had secured, and my full, unwavering cooperation to guarantee that Felicia and her co-conspirators spent decades behind bars. He realized with a sickening jolt of clarity that the daughter he had spent a lifetime degrading, insulting, and attempting to ruin now held the absolute power of life and death over his golden child. Richard's knees suddenly buckled. He did not stumble or lose his balance. He intentionally, deliberately collapsed onto the hard wooden floor of my office. The wealthy, powerful CEO, the man who had demanded total submission from everyone around him, fell heavily to his knees right in front of my desk. He clasped his hands together, his fingers intertwined so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. Tears welled up in his eyes, spilling over his lower lashes and tracking down his weathered cheeks. He looked up at me, his voice trembling with a raw, pathetic desperation that made my skin crawl. He begged me to stop this. He pleaded with me to contact the federal prosecutors and refuse to press charges. He swore that he would find a way to pay back the $2 million, claiming he would liquidate his retirement account, sell the cars, or beg his wealthy associates for a private loan. He cried that Felicia was weak, that she would never survive a single day in a federal penitentiary, and that a criminal conviction would permanently destroy her entire life. He completely ignored the fact that she had intentionally tried to destroy mine. He crawled slightly forward on his knees, reaching out as if to touch the edge of my desk. He begged me to remember that we were family. He weaponized the very concept of blood loyalty that he had so casually discarded when he tried to steal my business just 20 minutes prior. He sobbed heavily, the sound wet and echoing in the quiet room. He asked for mercy. He pleaded for a delay, begging me to hold off on handing over the final critical forensic dossiers Nathan had prepared for the prosecuting attorneys. He looked up, his face a mask of total devastation, and begged me for just 24 hours to figure out a solution to fix the unfixable mess they had created. He pleaded for one single day to save his family. I looked down at the pathetic weeping man kneeling on my floor. I felt absolutely no pity, no guilt, and no familial obligation. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound, unshakable peace. I leaned slightly forward, placing my hands flat on the smooth mahogany surface of my desk. I looked directly into his desperate, tear-filled eyes. I told him to get up off my floor and get out of my restaurant. I stated clearly and coldly that I would give him exactly what he asked for. I would give him the time. I looked at him with a perfectly calm, unwavering gaze and told him that I would deliver my final, absolute answer regarding his golden child's freedom at the highly anticipated VIP charity dinner tomorrow night. Saturday evening descended upon Chicago with a crisp, electric chill, bringing with it the most critical night of my professional career. My restaurant had been completely transformed into an exclusive, high-security fortress of culinary perfection. Tonight was not just a regular service. It was the highly anticipated launch of my new seasonal tasting menu paired with an elite charity auction. The dining room was packed to absolute capacity with the upper echelon of Chicago society. Renowned food critics from national publications sat shoulder to shoulder with ruthless venture capitalists, elite real estate developers, and the city's most influential philanthropists. The air buzzed with the sharp clinking of imported crystal flutes and the low, refined murmurs of power brokers. I stood near the glowing heat of the expo line, impeccably dressed in my custom-tailored executive chef coat, overseeing the flawless execution of the evening's opening service. At exactly 8:15, a sharp, disruptive commotion erupted near the front entrance, threatening to shatter the carefully curated atmosphere. I immediately noticed my head of security, a towering, heavily built former police officer named Thomas, physically blocking the heavy glass double doors. Standing on the other side, practically vibrating with frantic, desperate entitlement, were Richard and Diana. They looked completely out of place, their usual veneer of aristocratic superiority badly fractured. Richard's expensive tuxedo looked noticeably rumpled, and Diana's designer gown could not hide the frantic, hollow panic echoing in her eyes. Felicia was currently sitting in a Stark federal holding facility, entirely denied bail because Nathan had successfully frozen every single one of Richard's financial assets pending the fraud investigation. They were completely out of time, out of money, and out of options. I wiped my hands on a pristine white towel and walked calmly across the crowded dining room, projecting an aura of absolute unshakable authority. When I reached the host stand, Richard was aggressively shoving two embossed gold foil tickets into Thomas's broad chest. He loudly demanded immediate entry, aggressively claiming he possessed legitimate, highly exclusive VIP guest of honor passes. I glanced down at the shimmering gold tickets and instantly recognized them. They were passes that had mysteriously gone missing from my private office desk weeks ago. Felicia had stolen them during her initial campaign of identity theft, likely intending to use them to network her way into my private investor circles. Now her desperate parents were using her stolen loot as a final pathetic battering ram to breach my sanctuary. Thomas looked at me, his shoulders tensed, completely ready to physically eject them into the freezing Chicago night. Richard locked eyes with me, his face twisting into a mask of pure vindictive malice. He leaned forward, aggressively invading my personal space, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper intended only for my ears. He issued his final, desperate ultimatum. He threatened that if I did not let them inside immediately and sign the legal waivers to drop the federal charges against Felicia, he would create a massive, unprecedented public scene. He swore he would scream to every journalist, critic, and investor in the room that I was a fraudulent, backstabbing daughter who was actively sending her own innocent sister to a federal penitentiary out of sheer jealousy. Diana flanked him, her eyes wide and wet, thoroughly prepared to unleash her theatrical weeping mother routine to completely ruin the most important night of my career. They thought they held the ultimate trump card. They firmly believed my fear of public humiliation and professional ruin would finally force me to surrender to their extortion. They were completely wrong. I did not flinch. I did not call for the police to drag them away. Instead, a slow, freezing smile spread across my face. I looked directly at Richard, seeing right through his pathetic, transparent bluff. I knew exactly how much these people worship social status. I knew with absolute certainty that they would rather die than actually humiliate themselves in front of the exact billionaires, socialites, and elites they had spent their entire lives desperately trying to impress. I raised my hand and calmly instructed Thomas to stand down and step aside. I turned to my maitre d' and spoke in a clear, projecting voice that effortlessly carried to the nearby tables. I happily announced that my parents had arrived to support my charity launch and required immediate seating. The sudden attention of the room instantly shifted toward the entryway. Several prominent investors and a well-known food critic turned their heads, watching the interaction with keen, polite interest. Richard and Diana stiffened instantly. The threat of making a loud, destructive scene completely evaporated the second the spotlight swung in their direction. They were instantly trapped by their own desperate need to maintain their aristocratic facade in front of an elite audience. They quickly plastered on stiff, unnatural smiles, nodding tightly to the observing guests. I did not just invite them inside. I orchestrated their exact placement with ruthless tactical precision. I commanded the waitstaff to retrieve a heavy oak reserve table and set it up directly in the absolute center of the main dining room, right under the massive, cascading crystal chandelier. It was the most exposed, highly visible location in the entire building. There were no shadows to hide in. There were no quiet, secluded corners for hushed, venomous threats. They would be completely surrounded on all sides by Chicago's most powerful elite, forced to sit under the glaring, inescapable spotlight of public scrutiny. The waitstaff moved with military efficiency, dropping a pristine white tablecloth, setting the fine imported silver, and lighting a center candle in record time. I graciously extended my arm, inviting my parents to take their prominent seats of honor. Richard's jaw clenched so tightly, I thought his teeth might shatter under the pressure. He realized instantly that I had completely neutralized his only weapon. If he raised his voice, if Diana shed a single theatrical tear, they would be the ones committing irreversible social suicide in front of the city's most influential power brokers. They walked stiffly toward the center of the room, moving like condemned prisoners marching to the gallows. Their forced, unnatural smiles looked more like painful grimaces. They took their seats at the center table, looking completely exposed, incredibly vulnerable, and entirely out of their depth. The surrounding guests offered polite, welcoming nods, entirely unaware of the intense psychological warfare playing out right in front of them. I walked over to their table, leaning down smoothly, so my face was merely inches from Richard's sweating forehead. I kept my posture relaxed and my voice perfectly pleasant, ensuring anyone watching would simply assume a dedicated daughter was warmly welcoming her parents to her establishment. I looked deeply into his panicked eyes. I reminded Richard that he had dropped to his knees yesterday and begged me for a definitive answer regarding his golden child within 24 hours. I told him that I always kept my promises. I advised him to sit perfectly still, maintain his fake smile, and quietly endure the exclusive tasting menu. I whispered that their very first course was currently being plated in the kitchen, and it would arrive with the exact absolute answer he had been begging for. Richard stared up at me, a heavy bead of cold sweat trailing down the side of his face, completely paralyzed by the terrifying realization that he was no longer the predator, but the prey trapped in a cage entirely of my design. I stepped back from their table, leaving Richard suffocating in his own terror beneath the glaring light of the central chandelier. The immaculate waitstaff descended immediately, serving the first course, a delicate amuse-bouche of seared scallop with golden caviar. Richard stared down at the pristine plate, as if it were laced with poison. 30 minutes later, the vacant chair at their table was finally filled. Felicia slipped into the dining room through a discreet side entrance. Richard's expensive, high-powered lawyers had apparently worked a minor miracle by securing an emergency bail hearing late that afternoon. She looked incredibly pale, her designer gown failing to completely mask the exhausted, hollow look of someone who had just spent the most terrifying night of her life in a federal holding cell. Yet the exact moment she sat down, she plastered on a desperate, manufactured smile. They were going all in on this final pathetic charade. The charity dinner progressed flawlessly, a symphony of culinary perfection that cemented Horizon Holdings as the absolute pinnacle of Chicago's dining scene. The venture capitalists nodded in deep appreciation, the notoriously harsh food critics eagerly took notes, and the elite philanthropists happily engaged in the silent auction. I observed it all from the pass, watching my family force down every exquisite course while drowning in their own silent panic. As the final dessert plates were cleared away, the lights in the main dining room dimmed softly, focusing entirely on the raised stage at the front of the room. A massive high-definition projector screen behind the podium displayed the elegant minimalist Horizon Holdings logo. The ambient chatter faded as I stepped out from the kitchen, removed my apron, and walked confidently up the steps to the stage. A wave of genuine, enthusiastic applause washed over the room. I gripped the edges of the wooden podium and began my address. I spoke clearly about my journey, the grueling dedication required to build an empire from absolute scratch, and the massive charitable initiative we were launching tonight to support underprivileged culinary students. The audience was completely captivated, hanging on to my every word. Richard could not take it anymore. He saw the wealthy investors looking at me with total respect, and his greedy, desperate mind calculated that this was his final absolute window of opportunity. If he trapped me publicly in front of the very people who funded and supported my empire, he believed I could not possibly say no without destroying my own pristine reputation. He abruptly grabbed his crystal wine glass and a heavy silver spoon. The sharp, piercing sound of metal clinking against glass violently cut through my speech. The entire crowd turned their heads in confusion. Richard was standing up at the center table. He no longer looked terrified. He looked like a cornered, vicious animal making one last desperate leap for survival. He began to speak loudly, his booming, practiced corporate voice easily carrying across the silent dining room without needing a microphone. He marched directly toward the stage, his arms spread wide in a gesture of false, overwhelming paternal pride. He loudly declared to the room that he simply had to interrupt, claiming that watching his brilliant daughter speak filled him with an emotion only a proud father could truly understand. He stepped heavily onto the stage, imposing his large frame into my space, attempting to physically dominate the moment, just as he had done for my entire life. He turned to the elite crowd, flashing his trademark charismatic smile, and began to spin a masterfully manipulative tale. He boldly lied to the city's most powerful people, claiming that he had personally mentored me, that my relentless drive was the true Montgomery family trait, and that he had secretly supported my culinary dreams from the very beginning. He painted a disgusting, entirely fictional picture of a united, loving family working tirelessly together behind the scenes to build this restaurant. Then he made his grand, extortionate declaration. He raised his voice, ensuring every single journalist and investor in the room heard him perfectly. He announced that, to celebrate this incredible milestone, and to honor our deep family traditions, the Montgomery family was officially bringing Horizon Holdings back into the fold. He proudly declared that he was acquiring a 25% equity stake in my company, stating that we were finally merging our empires to ensure the family legacy continued forever. He looked down at his table with a triumphant, sickening grin. Right on cue, Diana stood up. She pressed a delicate lace handkerchief to her eyes, performing the role of the overwhelmed, intensely proud mother with flawless theatrical precision. Felicia stood up right next to her, clapping enthusiastically and wiping away her own manufactured tears. She smiled radiantly at the stage, playing the perfectly supportive, loving sister, completely hiding the fact that she was currently facing decades in a federal penitentiary. They looked exactly like the perfect, loving family, unconditionally supporting their highly successful daughter. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the wealthy crowd. Several people began to clap, entirely fooled by the heartwarming public display of familial unity and corporate expansion. Richard leaned his head slightly toward mine, keeping his wide smile fixed firmly in place for the audience, but his eyes were dead cold and utterly ruthless. He whispered through his teeth that I had absolutely no choice. He hissed that if I denied his generous offer now, I would look like an ungrateful, malicious, money-hungry sociopath in front of the exact people I needed to survive. He thought he had brilliantly checkmated me in front of the entire city. I slowly turned my head and looked at Richard. I looked down at Diana and Felicia, who were acting their hearts out for the cameras and the critics. I did not show an ounce of anger, panic, or submission. I simply stepped forward, positioning myself directly in front of the microphone, and raised my right hand in the air. The gesture was so calm, so absolute, and so intensely commanding that the scattered applause instantly died out. The entire dining room fell into a breathless, heavily expectant silence. The tension in the air became thick enough to cut with a knife. I lowered my hand and looked directly out into the sea of elite guests, my voice ringing out with icy crystal clarity. I stated that I wanted to sincerely thank Richard for his deeply moving words regarding the true nature of the Montgomery family legacy. I told the silent crowd that transparency and honesty were the absolute foundational pillars of my business, and it was finally time to show everyone exactly what that legacy entailed. I turned my head slightly, maintaining my cold gaze on my father's suddenly rigid face, and pressed a small black remote control resting on the podium. The elegant Horizon Holdings logo on the massive projector screen behind me abruptly vanished. Instead, a massive, highly detailed digital image materialized in blinding white light. It was an official, legally binding property deed. The bold black text clearly identified Horizon Holdings as the sole indisputable owner of the premier downtown commercial property we were currently standing inside. Right below it, a secondary document appeared stamped with heavy red municipal seals. It was a comprehensive corporate debt transfer. I leaned closer to the microphone, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. I announced to the silent, captive audience that my father was absolutely correct about one specific thing. The Montgomery family was deeply intertwined with Horizon Holdings. I explained that I had not just built a successful restaurant empire from the ground up entirely without their financial assistance. I had also quietly structured a private equity firm that aggressively acquired undervalued commercial real estate and toxic corporate debt. I paused, letting the information sink into the minds of the savvy investors in the room. I looked directly down at Richard, who was now clutching the edges of his table, his knuckles bone white, his face completely drained of color. I told the crowd that exactly 3 days ago, Horizon Holdings had executed a highly confidential financial maneuver. We had systematically approached the most aggressive, unforgiving creditors currently circling the Montgomery family estate. I announced, my voice ringing with cold, absolute authority, that I had privately purchased every single cent of my father's severely underwater mortgages. I did not just own this restaurant building. I owned his massive, sprawling suburban mansion. I owned the heavily leveraged commercial properties his failing firm desperately managed. I held the exclusive legal rights to liquidate his entire professional and personal existence. I looked at Richard and delivered the final devastating blow. I reminded him that just 24 hours ago he had arrogantly threatened to call the actual owner of this building to have me violently evicted. In its place, a massive, brilliantly illuminated digital document flashed onto the screen, rendering the entire dining room in a stark, unforgiving white light. It was not a celebratory merger announcement. It was a heavily redacted, legally certified application for a $2 million hard money loan. The document was magnified to 20 feet tall, making it entirely impossible for anyone in the room to look away or claim ignorance. I leaned into the microphone, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings with cold, surgical precision. I directed the audience's attention to the signature line at the bottom of the application. It was my name forged with desperate, sloppy haste. Right next to it, displayed in high definition, was the secondary identification submitted to secure the fraudulent funds. It was a scanned copy of a driver's license bearing my stolen social security number, but the photograph staring back at the entire room unmistakably belonged to Felicia Montgomery. A collective sharp intake of breath swept through the elite crowd. The venture capitalists and philanthropists who just moments ago had politely applauded my father's heartwarming speech now stared at the screen in absolute horrified fascination. I did not give my family a single second to recover or interrupt. I calmly explained to the silent room that exactly 4 months ago, Felicia had systematically stolen my identity. I detailed how she had used my pristine credit history to secure a predatory high-interest loan from a shadow lender, because every single reputable financial institution in the state of Illinois had permanently blacklisted the Montgomery name. Felicia's manufactured smile violently shattered. The elegant, supportive sister facade disintegrated instantly, leaving behind a terrified, cornered fraud. She jumped up from her chair wildly, waving her arms, her designer gown tangling around her legs. She shrieked that the documents were completely fabricated. She screamed to the crowd that I was a jealous, vindictive liar who had hacked into her computer to frame her. I simply pressed the black remote control a second time. The screen instantly transitioned to a certified digital bank routing trace. I traced the bright red line on the projection showing the exact path the $2 million took. I narrated the journey of the stolen funds, explaining how the money bypassed my accounts entirely and was wired directly into an offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. I then highlighted the recovery email address attached to that specific shell corporation. It was Felicia's private personal email, the exact same email address she used to coordinate her highly publicized, entirely fake philanthropic charity events. Felicia clamped her hands over her mouth, stumbling backward until she hit the edge of the table. The irrefutable digital proof loomed over her, crushing her pathetic denials into dust. Richard finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He slammed his fist down on the table, his face flushed a dangerous, mottled purple. He aggressively pointed at me, his booming voice cracking with raw panic. He yelled that this was a private family dispute and had absolutely no place in a public business forum. He commanded the waitstaff to turn off the projector immediately, desperately trying to reassert his authority. I ignored his frantic commands. I looked directly out into the crowd, my eyes specifically seeking out a cluster of older, highly distinguished men and women sitting at the premium VIP booths near the front. I had deliberately ensured their invitations were personally delivered. They were Richard's most prominent, deeply invested financial backers. I addressed them directly, my voice slicing through my father's panicked shouting. I stated that the fraudulent loan was merely a symptom of a much larger terminal disease. I clicked the remote for the third and final time. The massive screen shifted to display the authentic, fully audited financial ledgers of Montgomery Real Estate Holdings. It was a bloodbath of red ink. The screen displayed dozens of final default notices, violently over-leveraged commercial mortgages, and a staggering list of completely empty, decaying shell properties that Richard had been falsely claiming as prime, fully developed assets. I looked at the furious investors and delivered the ultimate financial guillotine. I explained that Richard Montgomery was not a billionaire titan of industry. He was a desperate, drowning man running a sophisticated corporate Ponzi scheme. I revealed that he had not been using their freshly injected capital to develop new commercial real estate. Instead, he had been illegally siphoning their investment funds to desperately pay off the crushing overdue interest on his toxic failing properties just to keep the lights on for one more month. I pointed directly at Richard, who was now visibly trembling, sweat pouring down his forehead and soaking into his expensive tuxedo collar. I told the investors that his dramatic public attempt to claim a 25% equity stake in my restaurant tonight was not a proud father expanding his empire. It was a pathetic, last-ditch extortion attempt. He desperately needed to project the illusion of new liquid assets to pacify his angry investors and delay the inevitable bankruptcy audits. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and utterly explosive. The polite, refined atmosphere of the charity gala vanished completely. A prominent real estate mogul, a man who had partnered with Richard for over a decade, shot up from his booth. He slammed his crystal glass down so hard the stem snapped. He pointed a furious, accusing finger directly at Richard's face, his voice roaring over the chaotic murmurs of the dining room. He demanded to know exactly where his $10 million development fund had gone. Other investors quickly followed suit, standing up and aggressively shouting demands for their missing capital. The illusion of the untouchable aristocratic Montgomery dynasty shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in the center of my dining room. They were completely exposed. The bespoke suits, the luxury cars, and the arrogant sneers were all stripped away, leaving nothing but a family of desperate broke criminals cornered by the very elite society they worshipped. Diana let out a sharp, hysterical wail. She clutched her diamond necklace, looking frantically at the furious faces of the high society women she had spent decades trying to impress. Those same women were now staring back at her with absolute disgust and open contempt. Diana's carefully constructed social standing, the only thing she valued in this world, evaporated instantly. She sank into her chair, burying her face in her hands, completely destroyed by the crushing weight of public humiliation. Felicia violently turned on our father. Her fear of federal prison completely overrode any remaining familial loyalty. She grabbed Richard's tuxedo jacket, shaking him frantically. She screamed that he had promised the investors would never find out. She shrieked that she only took the fraudulent loan because he had begged her to save the company, explicitly promising that he would manipulate me into paying it back. She actively, loudly confessed to conspiracy right in front of the very people they had defrauded. Richard shoved her away, his eyes wild and unfocused. He looked around the room, searching desperately for a single friendly face, an exit, an excuse. There was absolutely nothing. He was completely surrounded by his own victims. I stood silently at the podium, watching the chaotic, deafening destruction of my abusers. I did not need to raise a finger to hurt them. I had simply turned on the lights and let the truth do the work. Then, as the shouting and accusations reached a fever pitch, the heavy brass and glass double doors at the main entrance of the restaurant swung open. They did not open with the frantic, hurried rush of a late guest. They opened with a slow, deliberate, and terrifying sense of absolute authority. The room closest to the entrance instantly fell silent. That silence rapidly cascaded across the dining room like a shockwave, hushing the furious investors and silencing Felicia's hysterical sobbing. 6 individuals stepped into the foyer. They were not wearing evening gowns or tailored tuxedos. They were dressed in sharp, dark windbreakers, bearing the stark, bright yellow lettering of federal financial regulatory agencies. They moved in perfect, intimidating synchronization, their expressions completely grim and unyielding. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with steel-gray hair, held a thick stack of legally bound, heavily stamped warrants in his hand. They did not pause to ask for directions. They bypassed the host stand entirely. Their eyes locked with laser precision onto the center table under the crystal chandelier. They marched silently and purposefully through the parted crowd, the heavy thud of their tactical boots echoing loudly against the hardwood floor. Their destination was absolutely clear. They were heading straight for Felicia and Richard Montgomery. The lead agent stopped directly in front of the center table, his imposing frame casting a long, dark shadow over my father. He did not ask for permission. He did not offer professional courtesies. He simply demanded absolute compliance. "Felicia Montgomery," the agent stated, his voice a flat, uncompromising baritone that carried easily through the silent dining room. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. You have the right to remain silent." Two agents flanked her instantly. Felicia let out a guttural, panicked shriek and tried to scramble backward. Her heavy dining chair tipped over with a loud wooden crash, but she was entirely boxed in. There was nowhere to run. One agent grabbed her wrist, twisting it firmly behind her back with practiced clinical efficiency. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed like a gunshot across the room. Richard jumped to his feet, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. He pointed a trembling finger at the agents, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to summon his shattered authority. He demanded that they release his daughter immediately. He threatened to call the governor, the chief of police, and his personal legal team. He screamed that this was a massive, humiliating misunderstanding orchestrated by a jealous rival. The lead agent did not even flinch. He slowly reached into his dark jacket and pulled out a secondary thick envelope sealed with red tape. "Richard Montgomery," the agent said, his eyes locking onto my father with total disdain. "You are being served with a federal subpoena for immediate questioning regarding corporate embezzlement, gross financial mismanagement, and investor fraud. As of this exact moment, every single one of your personal and corporate assets has been officially frozen by federal mandate. I highly suggest you stop talking and call your legal counsel." The remaining color drained entirely from Richard's face. His mouth hung open, but no words came out. His knees buckled slightly, and he collapsed back into his chair, staring blankly at the federal subpoena resting on the pristine white tablecloth. The agents hauled Felicia to her feet. She was weeping hysterically, her expensive designer gown dragging heavily on the floor, her carefully styled hair plastered to her wet face. They marched her through the center aisle of the restaurant. The elite investors, critics, and philanthropists parted like the Red Sea, watching in absolute horrified silence as the Montgomery golden child was paraded out in federal handcuffs. Diana remained frozen in her seat, her hands covering her face, letting out a continuous high-pitched wail of pure despair. I stood at the podium and watched the heavy glass doors swing shut behind the federal agents. The cancer that had plagued my entire life was finally excised. 9 hours later, the morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my attorney's high-rise corner office. I sat comfortably at the head of a massive mahogany conference table, holding a steaming cup of black coffee. My lead corporate attorney, a ruthless, brilliant man named Marcus, sat quietly to my right, reviewing a towering stack of legal documents. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the conference room clicked open. Richard, Diana, and Felicia slowly shuffled inside. They did not look like the arrogant, untouchable aristocrats who had tried to extort me the night before. They looked like walking corpses. Felicia's high-powered lawyers had apparently worked through the night to secure an emergency, highly restricted bail, but the terrifying reality of a federal holding cell had completely broken her. She wore a plain gray sweatshirt, her face devoid of makeup, her eyes swollen and bloodshot. Richard looked 10 years older, his shoulders severely hunched, his hands trembling violently. Diana looked thoroughly hollowed out, her usual manicured perfection replaced by a frantic, unwashed desperation. They took their seats at the far end of the long table. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. There were no demands this morning, There were no arrogant threats or corporate ultimatums. They were completely stripped of their weapons, their wealth, and their pride. Richard was the first to break the silence. His voice was a weak, pathetic rasp. He looked down at his hands, entirely unable to meet my eyes. He whispered that his lawyers had thoroughly reviewed the property deeds and the corporate debt transfers I had executed. He admitted, his voice cracking with humiliation, that I held the absolute legal power to instantly trigger a total liquidation of his entire company and his personal estate. He confessed that without my signature granting an emergency extension, the banks would seize his home, his cars, and every remaining asset by the end of the week. Felicia began to sob loudly, her shoulders shaking. She looked up at me, her face a mask of pure terror. She pleaded that the federal prosecutors were offering a terrifyingly harsh sentence for the identity theft and wire fraud. She begged me to sign a sworn affidavit stating that I had retroactively authorized the $2 million loan. She cried that it was the only possible way to drastically reduce her impending prison sentence. She promised she would pay me back every single cent, even if it took the rest of her life. Then Richard did something I never thought I would witness in my entire lifetime. The proud, tyrannical patriarch of the Montgomery family pushed his heavy leather chair back, stepped out from the table, and slowly dropped to his knees on the carpeted floor. He clasped his trembling hands together, looking up at me with wet, desperate eyes. He begged for mercy. He pleaded that he had made terrible, unforgivable mistakes, but that I was still his daughter, his flesh and blood. He swore that if I just signed the debt extension waivers and the legal release forms for Felicia, he would publicly transfer control of his remaining salvageable assets to me. He promised he would walk away and never interfere in my life again. Diana immediately threw herself out of her chair and dropped to her knees right next to him. She reached her hands out across the mahogany table, her voice a shrill theatrical whine of ultimate maternal guilt. "Please, Hazel." Diana wept, tears streaming down her pale face. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot send your own sister to a federal prison. You cannot throw your own parents out onto the street. We are your family. We share the same blood. No matter what happened in the past, family always forgives each other. You have to forgive us." I looked down at the two people who had made my childhood a living nightmare, kneeling on the floor like broken beggars. I looked at the sister who had happily stolen my identity and actively tried to destroy my future just to maintain her luxury lifestyle. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity, no guilt, and certainly no forgiveness. There was only cold, profound clarity. I set my coffee cup down on the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I moved with slow, deliberate precision. I reached into my leather briefcase resting on the chair beside me and pulled out a single, neatly folded piece of thick, high-quality paper. I did not pull out a legal waiver. I did not pull out a debt extension contract. I slid the folded paper across the smooth mahogany table. It glided silently until it stopped right at the edge, directly in front of Richard and Diana's desperate, grasping hands. Richard reached up with shaking fingers and unfolded the paper, his eyes wide with frantic, pathetic hope. He thought I was giving him a lifeline. He thought his kneeling had worked. He stared at the paper. His expression instantly morphed from desperate hope to utter devastating confusion, and finally to absolute horror. It was a restaurant receipt. It was the exact itemized $4,000 bill from the agonizing family dinner 5 years ago. The dinner where they had mocked my culinary dreams, celebrated Felicia's fake promotions, and viciously forced me to empty my meager, hard-earned savings just to humiliate me before officially cutting me out of their lives entirely. I had kept the receipt as a daily reminder of exactly why I needed to survive. "Diana just said that family always forgives each other," I stated, my voice echoing like ice in the quiet room. "She said that this table is for family." I stood up, buttoning my tailored suit jacket, looking down at my abusers with total, unyielding finality. "That table is for family." I repeated, quoting the exact cruel words my sister had used against me half a decade ago. "And I haven't had a family for 5 years. I owe you absolutely nothing." I turned to my lawyer. "Marcus, execute the asset liquidations immediately. Do not grant a single extension. Contact the federal prosecutor and inform them that I will not sign any waivers, and I will fully testify against Felicia Montgomery regarding the identity theft. Felicia let out a blood-curdling scream of pure despair, burying her head in her arms on the table. Richard collapsed forward onto the carpet, his chest heaving as he gasped for air, completely destroyed by the realization that it was truly over. Diana merely stared blankly at the $4,000 receipt, her mind entirely unable to process the absolute totality of her ruin. I did not look back as I walked out of the conference room. I stepped into the elevator, the heavy doors sliding shut, cutting off the sounds of their weeping. 6 months later, the crisp autumn wind whipped through the towering oak trees lining the most exclusive private drive in the Chicago suburbs. I stood on the cracked asphalt, pulling my tailored wool coat tighter around my shoulders. Beside me stood Marcus, my lead corporate attorney, holding a pristine leather folio containing the finalized legally binding property deeds. Directly in front of us sat the sprawling palatial Montgomery estate. It was a massive, imposing structure of imported stone and towering columns originally built to project an aura of untouchable wealth and aristocratic superiority. Now it was nothing more than a hollow, decaying shell. The massive wrought iron gates, once guarded by private security to keep the less fortunate out, hung slightly off their hinges. The pristine, manicured lawns where Diana used to host her pretentious, hypocritical garden parties were severely overgrown and choked with brown weeds. The bank foreclosure had been swift, brutal, and entirely unyielding. When Richard's fraudulent empire collapsed into dust, the federal authorities and rabid creditors had stripped the property bare, auctioning off the antique furniture, the imported chandeliers, and the luxury vehicles to recoup fractions of a penny on the stolen dollars. The property had sat vacant for months, a toxic asset that no respectable buyer in the city wanted to touch due to the highly publicized, deeply humiliating scandal attached to the Montgomery name. That was exactly when I instructed Marcus to make a move. Horizon Holdings purchased the entire estate directly from the bank at an aggressively discounted rate. I did not buy it to live in it. I did not buy it to flip it for a profit. I bought it to erase it. A heavy rumbling vibration shook the asphalt beneath my boots. I turned my head and watched a convoy of massive bright yellow industrial bulldozers and heavy demolition excavators rolling slowly up the sweeping driveway. Their diesel engines roared with a deafening, magnificent power. Marcus opened his leather folio and handed me a sleek silver fountain pen. He presented the final municipal demolition permits. I did not hesitate. I signed my name with bold, fluid strokes officially authorizing the total destruction of the house that had served as my childhood prison. I handed the pen back to Marcus and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the demolition foreman standing by the lead excavator. The massive hydraulic arm of the machine swung upward, its heavy steel teeth gleaming in the morning sunlight. With a terrifying crunch of splintering wood and shattering glass, the excavator smashed directly into the grand front entryway of the Montgomery mansion. I stood perfectly still, watching the ornate mahogany double doors be ripped from their hinges and crushed into splinters. A thick cloud of gray dust plumed into the air as the heavy stone facade collapsed inward. Every crashing blow of the machinery felt like a physical weight being lifted off my chest. I watched the excavator tear into the formal dining room. That was the exact room where I had been forced to sit in miserable silence for 18 years, while Richard and Diana belittled my existence, mocked my aspirations, and ruthlessly praised Felicia's every mediocre achievement. I watched the crystal windows shatter and the walls cave in, completely obliterating the physical space where my self-worth had been systematically dismantled. The heavy machines moved relentlessly, tearing down the grand staircase, crushing the luxurious master suites, and completely flattening the monument to Richard's monstrous ego and Diana's shallow vanity. I felt absolutely no nostalgia. I felt no sorrow. I felt a profound, exhilarating sense of absolute liberation. I was not just tearing down a house, I was actively clearing the ground for the future. Horizon Holdings had already secured the necessary zoning permits to completely redevelop this massive, sprawling acreage. Where the Montgomery mansion once stood, I was building the Horizon Culinary Academy. It would be a state-of-the-art, fully funded training facility specifically designed for underprivileged teenagers and young adults who had aged out of the foster care system. I was going to take the exact physical space where I was told I would never amount to anything and transform it into a sanctuary where marginalized kids would be given the absolute best culinary education, full housing, and guaranteed job placement within my restaurant empire. I was turning a monument of toxic elitism into a fortress of genuine opportunity. I watched the roof of the mansion finally cave in on itself, sending a massive shockwave of dust rolling across the overgrown lawn. The Montgomery legacy was officially dead and buried. I turned away from the rubble, my mind already shifting back to my own thriving empire, and stepped into the back of my waiting town car. An hour later, I was sitting behind the sleek glass desk in my top-floor executive office in downtown Chicago. The room was bathed in bright, natural light overlooking the bustling city that I had conquered entirely on my own terms. My executive assistant walked quietly into the room, placing a stack of sorted mail and daily operational reports on my desk. Right on top of the neat stack lay 3 envelopes made of cheap, flimsy paper. They were stamped with heavy black federal penitentiary ink. The return address, printed in the corner, clearly indicated a high-security federal correctional facility located in a remote part of the state. The handwriting on the envelopes was erratic, jagged, and desperately rushed. It was undeniably Felicia's handwriting. I sat back in my leather chair and stared at the envelopes. For the past 6 months, these letters had been arriving with increasing frantic frequency. I knew exactly what they contained, without ever needing to open them. They contained the desperate whining pleas of a woman who had finally been stripped of her unearned privilege and thrown into a harsh, unforgiving reality. They would be filled with pathetic apologies that were not rooted in genuine remorse, but in a desperate desire for commissary money, for high-priced legal appeals, and for salvation. Felicia would undoubtedly be trying to leverage the concept of sisterhood, begging me to remember our shared blood, weeping about the harsh conditions of her confinement, and demanding that I use my wealth to rescue her from the consequences of her own malicious criminal actions. 5 years ago, a letter like that might have triggered a deep, ingrained sense of familial guilt. I might have felt obligated to read it to internalize her pain, to somehow fix the mess she had created. But I was no longer that frightened, subservient girl. I had mastered the most powerful, impenetrable weapon against toxic abusers. I had mastered the absolute power of no contact. No contact was not a temporary punishment. It was not a manipulation tactic meant to force an apology. It was a permanent, impenetrable fortress built around my peace of mind. It was the profound realization that I did not owe my abusers my time, my energy, my money, or my emotional bandwidth. They had lost the right to access my life the moment they actively chose to destroy it. I did not feel a single ounce of curiosity about what Felicia had written. Her words were entirely irrelevant to my reality. I picked up the 3 cheap envelopes, kept them completely sealed, and dropped them directly into the heavy-duty mechanical shredder sitting beside my desk. The machine hummed to life instantly, reducing Felicia's desperate manipulation attempts into tiny, illegible strips of worthless confetti. I did the exact same thing with the occasional pathetic voicemails Diana attempted to leave from whatever burner phone she could afford in her squalid, decaying apartment. I blocked the numbers, deleted the messages, and completely erased their existence from my daily routine. The silence they left behind was not empty. It was filled with the vibrant, beautiful noise of my own thriving life. I stood up from my desk, smoothed the lapels of my custom-tailored chef coat, and took the private elevator down to the main floor of my flagship restaurant. The moment the elevator doors opened, the intense, glorious energy of the kitchen hit me like a wave of pure electricity. The dinner service was just beginning, and the massive, gleaming stainless steel kitchen was operating at maximum capacity. It was a symphony of controlled chaos, a brilliant ballet of fire, steel, and culinary perfection. The air was thick with the rich, intoxicating aromas of roasting garlic, searing Wagyu beef, reducing red wine glazes, and fresh thyme. Dozens of highly trained chefs, sous chefs, and line cooks moved around each other with flawless, unspoken synchronization. They communicated in sharp, rapid calls of order tickets and precise confirmations. This was not a toxic environment of fear and subjugation. It was a kitchen built on absolute mutual respect, relentless dedication, and shared passion. I walked onto the line, and the energy immediately shifted. The staff did not cower or shrink away. They stood taller, their focus sharpening, their movements becoming even more precise. They looked at me with genuine, deep respect. I was not just their boss. I was the leader who had fought in the trenches right beside them, who knew every single station, and who demanded greatness because I pushed myself harder than anyone else. Standing at the central expo station, expertly inspecting every single plate before it left the kitchen, was Nathan. Nathan was my executive sous chef, my most trusted confidant, and the absolute anchor of my professional world. He had been with me since the very beginning, back when Horizon Holdings was nothing more than a desperate dream and a mountain of maxed-out credit cards. He had stood by my side during the grueling 100-hour work weeks, through the brutal restaurant reviews, and through the terrifying nights when I thought I might lose everything. He possessed a brilliant culinary mind, but more importantly, he possessed a fiercely loyal, unwavering heart. He looked up as I approached the pass, flashing a warm, genuine smile that instantly grounded me. He handed me a tasting spoon, offering a sample of a complex, heavily reduced wild mushroom demi-glace he had been perfecting all afternoon. I tasted it, the rich, earthy flavors exploding on my palate, and nodded in absolute approval. The silent, seamless communication between us spoke volumes of a partnership built on total trust. As the evening rush hit its absolute peak, I looked around the bustling, vibrant kitchen. I watched my team laughing through the pressure, supporting each other through the weeds, and celebrating every flawless plate that went out into the dining room. I realized with absolute clarity that this was my family. Family was not defined by the random biological accident of shared DNA. Family was not an unbreakable blood pact that required you to silently endure horrific abuse, financial extortion, and endless psychological torment. True family was a conscious, deliberate choice. Family was the people who actively chose to stand in the fire with you when everything else was burning down. Family was the people who celebrated your victories without an ounce of jealousy, who protected your peace, and who demanded nothing but your authentic self. The people standing in this hot, chaotic kitchen, the people who poured their souls into their craft right alongside me, they were my true family. They had earned my loyalty, and I had earned theirs. The dining room outside was packed to absolute capacity with Chicago's most discerning, powerful elite. But tonight was not just another successful dinner service. There was a unique, vibrating tension in the air, a crackling anticipation that had the entire staff on edge. At exactly 9:30, the heavy wooden doors of the kitchen swung open. The general manager of the restaurant walked in. He was a seasoned, stoic professional who rarely showed raw emotion, but right now his face was flushed, his eyes wide, and he was clutching a heavy, embossed envelope bearing a highly recognizable, prestigious insignia. The entire kitchen intuitively sensed the shift in the atmosphere. The clattering of pans slowed, the rapid-fire calling of tickets ceased. Dozens of chefs turned away from their cutting boards and stoves, their eyes locked onto the manager as he walked directly toward the expo station where Nathan and I were standing. He handed me the envelope. His hands were visibly shaking. I looked down at the thick, cream-colored paper. I recognized the emblem immediately. It was the official seal of the Michelin Guide. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, heavy, and breathless. Every single person in the room knew exactly what this meant. This was the ultimate, undisputed pinnacle of global culinary achievement. It was the impossible dream that millions of chefs chased for their entire lives, often driving themselves to ruin in the process. I broke the heavy wax seal with my thumb, my own hands remarkably steady. I pulled out the thick, embossed letterhead and read the short, elegant text printed in dark ink. I looked up from the letter. I looked at Nathan, whose eyes were shining with intense, hopeful anticipation. I looked at my dedicated line cooks, my pastry chefs, and my dishwashers. The incredibly diverse, beautiful chosen family that had bled and sweated for this exact moment. We got it, I said, my voice cutting clearly through the silent kitchen. 1 Michelin star. For a fraction of a second, there was total silence as the magnitude of the words registered. Then the kitchen absolutely erupted. It was a deafening, chaotic explosion of pure, unadulterated joy. Grown men and women screamed, cheered, and banged heavy metal spoons against stainless steel countertops. Chefs threw their pristine white towels high into the air. People were weeping openly, pulling each other into fierce, crushing hugs. Nathan grabbed me, lifting me off the floor in a massive, overwhelming embrace, spinning me around as the entire kitchen cheered around us. I laughed out loud, a sound of pure, uninhibited joy that echoed off the gleaming steel walls. There was no fear, no anxiety, no lingering shadows of my past. There was only this brilliant, shining moment of ultimate triumph. I stood in the center of my thriving, bustling restaurant, surrounded by the incredible people who loved and respected me for exactly who I was. The heavy, suffocating chains of the Montgomery family expectations were completely shattered, ground into dust along with their rotting mansion. I was finally absolutely free. I looked out at the brilliant, chaotic beauty of my kitchen, feeling a profound, unshakable strength settling deep into my bones. They called me a disappointment. They told me I was a failure, an embarrassment, a worthless outcast who would never survive without their money and their toxic approval. But I used that exact disappointment to build an empire they could never touch.